You're about to watch a recorded session from the Brand Podcast Summit. For more recordings or information on the podcasting events we have coming up very soon, go to brandpodcastsummit.com.
The Brand Podcast Summit.
I've been running Lower Street as a podcast agency for 7 years. And I think at the beginning of that period, 7 years ago, really a lot of what we were doing here at Lower Street was evangelizing podcasting. This is a really great medium you should all consider and get into as marketers. And I think what happened in 2019, 2020 is the pandemic took over and kind of did the hard work for us. I think we're now in a position in 2024 where every boardroom across the country, we're all talking about podcasting, whether it's something that we're doing actively right now or considering for the future. And I think that's why a lot of folks are joining us today, is that we're thinking about getting into podcasting and we're trying to understand how to navigate it. One thing that hasn't changed in that 7-year period is that whenever folks come to us, they say, we've never done this before, we don't know where to get started. And some of the most common question we ask is, how do we make something good? How do we make something differentiated? How do we stand out from all of the content that's out there? How do we, justify time in the listening calendar of our target audience? So that's a question that we spend a lot of time thinking about and helping clients with, and it's something that we wanted to bring on someone to speak about that can really speak to this subject very, very well. So we are joined for the title of the session is Standing Out from the Crowd, Making Podcast Content That Matters. And there's really only one person we could invite to come and speak about that subject, and that's Ann Handley, who I'm sure to many in the audience doesn't really need an introduction, but I will give her one briefly, which is that Ann. Hello, Ann. Hello. Ann, I'm going to introduce you here while you're standing here. So I'll be all self-conscious of myself, and I don't want to blush, but Ann is a Wall Street Journal best-selling author of the book Everybody Writes. She's the co-founder of Clicks with a Z, and the most influential woman in social media, according to Forbes. So I think she's earned her stripes. She can teach us a thing or two, and we're really excited to talk about the importance of standing out and how to stand out in a sort of crowded space in marketing. So hello, Ann. Thank you for joining.
Hello. Yeah, I'm sorry for coming in hot there. I guess I did come in a little
No,
hot.
you're good. It's wonderful.
It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to see so many friends in the chat in this session and in the last session. I can't figure out how to chat with everyone, so sorry about that. I only see a...
That's fine. Yes, the chat box is active, and the Q&A section in particular. So if there's anything that you want to ask, and we will have time for Q&A at the end.
Okay.
So stay active, stay alert, stay with us.
Keep your wits, as they say.
Yeah, exactly. So, Ann, look, we're here to talk about podcasting, and I guess content in general. I think a lot of what we're going to talk about is relevant to whatever form of content we're creating. But I do think there are some sort of specific nuances to podcasting. But let's start broad. What do you think the opportunity is with podcasts?
Oh my goodness. I do think that the way that we think about what makes for a successful podcast, or when we think about the opportunity of podcasts more specifically, I think it's true of so many owned media products. So for that, I would include, not just podcasts, but newsletters as well, or anything that we own ourselves, as opposed to renting time with people and audiences on, say, social media. We're here to talk about podcasts, but I do think that some of the things that we'll talk about today actually do apply more generally to a lot of your own media assets. Harry, when I thought about, what is the opportunity with podcasts for all of us, I wanted to ground our conversation today just by pulling in a little bit of data. I think so much great content is rooted in data, right? So it's not just my opinion, but it's actual data, actual research. And so every year, MarketingProfs, my company, does a bit of content marketing research. We partner with the Content Marketing Institute for it. And most recently, we found new research that came out just at the very end of last year. We asked marketers what kinds of content types that they are producing. These are my analog slides. I worked very hard. all morning long. And you know what's really exciting about these slides that I'm showing today? I actually learned how to do, wait for it, an animation. And so this is the animation. Rather than showing you the whole slide, I'm just going to show it to you a little bit.
AI? Who needs AI?
It's really great. You're going to love it. You're going to be like, wow. All right. So what kinds of content types are marketers producing, or did they produce at the very in 2023 into early 2024? Number one on the list is right there, short blog posts, short posts of any kind. Number two. Number two, videos at 84%. Lots of us are producing videos of one kind or another. Number three. Oh no.
Spoiler. It's fine.
I know. Number three, right here. Longer posts. So longer blog posts, more informational, how-to kind of things. Maybe cornerstone content for your blog, right. For example, 71%. And then there's all kinds of other things underneath this, right? So there's things like white papers and infographics and research and all kinds of things. And look at way down at the bottom here, 29% for podcasts. I was really surprised when I saw that.
Yeah.
It's just like in comparison, it's a pretty small number. So just 29.
And it's so interesting because marketers, the sort of common, I don't know if I'd go as far as say a trope, but a thing that we hear a lot is like, there's so many podcasts. Everyone has a podcast.
Yeah.
I think what that data point shows is that's not true. Actually, there's loads of empty space there.
Yeah, there is loads of empty space there. And so we also asked marketers, what are your challenges for 2024? All right. So the three challenges, number one, how do we actually create the kind of content that our audience wants? Like, how do we create engaging content? 57% of marketers are challenged by that. Makes sense. Next up, 54% are how do we create consistently? Like, how do we create the kind of content, not just one and done, but like on an extended basis, right? Because I think any content ideas are hard, right? And so the more that we can take those ideas and literally, parse them out across the life cycle of whatever it is that we are doing, the stronger the content will be. So how do we do it consistently? And then number three, how do we differentiate it? 54%. So these are all the top challenges that marketers have with their content marketing programs. And then the last bit of data that I want to share with you is that when we asked marketers, what are your 2024 priorities? There were three. Number one, no surprise to anybody here. How do we actually stand apart in an age of AI? Our mutual friend, Jay Acunzo, says that it's never been easier to create mediocrity at scale with AI. Right. And that is 100% true. Yep. The second thing that marketers are putting on their list of priorities for 2024 is how do we actually emphasize more thought leadership? Like, how do we get our thoughts and ideas and our executives to be front and center in our content programs? And then number three, how do we be a trusted resource for the people that we seek to serve or that we seek to sell to? Like, how do we be a trusted resource to our audience? And so I think of, like, when you asked me originally, what is the podcast opportunity? I think it's like these three charts tell the story about what the podcast opportunity is, because really, when you think about, if only 29% of marketers have been producing audio more recently, have been producing podcasts more recently, and then you look at what they seek to do and what the challenges are across the board, I feel like that there is a key opportunity in creating an owned media asset like a podcast that would truly be that trusted resource for your audience, that would really emphasize the thought leadership that is locked inside your company. And then also it allows you to stand apart, because you're not going to create content with a robot as your MC, right? It's like you actually get human voices speaking to other humans directly into their ears. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really interesting because, like, so one thing that I've said for a long time is that, you know, as humans, we buy from humans.
Yeah.
And that the brands need to be more human in the way that they communicate. And I feel like a lot of times, you know, when we get into sort of the corporate world or whatever, you know, it's very difficult to. People are afraid of saying the wrong thing. They want to make sure they come across in the right way, and they're sometimes a little afraid to maybe be human and be authentic to themselves, and it kind of discourages them from that. And I think this sort of rise of AI and this wave of mediocrity, as Jay Kudzo, like you said, says, I think that the antidote to that, the medicine to that, is to do the human thing, to lean into, you know, the fleshy, you know, wobbly parts of ourselves and actually put that out. And I think it doesn't have to be, obviously I'm massively biased, right? Podcasting is the best, but there's lots of other channels we can do that in as well. But I really think leaning into that stuff is the only way to stand apart. I'm also just fascinated by the fact that the overarching challenge that people are facing is this, or one of them is how do I stand apart? And it's something that I hear all the time. It's really interesting to hear that marketers are feeling that in all the channels that they're working in.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, listen, I am a big believer in generative AI to help us in content marketing and to help us do our jobs more effectively and more efficiently. I use AI. I am not an AI hater by any stretch. Yeah. But I also think that if we over rely on AI as a way to create content, then we are really doing ourselves a disservice as marketers, because yes, it gives us the ability to create more, but it also gives us the ability to sound more synthetic. And we don't want to do that as marketers. Just as you were talking, I was thinking about how, I don't know if you heard this, but Merriam-Webster, you know, American Dictionary, they said at the very end of last year that the word authentic is the word of the year for.
Yes. Yeah, I did hear that. Yeah.
Right. And so for me, that was like, when I heard that, I thought, God, I have been talking about being authentic for a very long time, but honestly, often I disrespect it because I don't love that word. I feel like, what does that actually mean? Like, what does it mean to be authentic? What does it actually mean? But I feel like in 2024 in marketing, it actually does suddenly make sense, doesn't it? That, you know, you don't want to come across as inauthentic. And really the antidote to that is to show up as people. Yep. And to form those direct, warm relationships with the people that we care the most about, to nurture those relationships so that when they are ready to buy from us, we are already in the consideration set. You know, we're already there. And so there's lots of reasons why I think that it's so important to think about building your brand through owned media properties like newsletters, like podcasts. But I think the time has never been more critical at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. That's amazing. So let's go to a slightly more straightforward question. How do you define a good podcast?
Here's the thing. There's no such thing as a good podcast, really. Like, there's no such thing as or I should say, there's no one definition for a good podcast, and there's no one definition for a successful podcast. Like, when people think about a good podcast, they think about, you know, the ones that have massive followings, like, I don't know, like Oprah Winfrey's podcast. You know, it's like, that's not what, in my mind, that's not necessarily what makes for a good podcast. I mean, I think the short answer of what makes for a good podcast is that it does two things. It has a clear purpose and a clear role in a global sense, voice and point of view, number one. And number two, it's compelling to the people who it seeks to reach. You know, I mean, just sort of flat out, that's how I think about it.
Yeah. Awesome. So yeah, I one of the things, you know, we talked about standing out, and one of the things that clients say to us all the time is, you know, there's a lot of competition. How do we create something that's unique and compelling? And so I guess, yeah, off the back of that, you know, you mentioned that definition. Like, how do we then go ahead and do that?
How do we go ahead and like create something that's good for our
audience? And only we could create, right? It's like, I love that idea. It's like, I believe that. I buy that. I want to do that. And it's like, okay, cool. Now what? Like, what's my next step, you know?
Yeah. Now what, Ann? Yeah. Good thought. Here's how I think about it. I'm going to throw up another slide. I think about the best podcasts, again, for us, it answers these two questions. It answers the question, why? Why are we creating the podcast that we are creating? What's the intent behind it? What's the goal for it? What do we hope it to accomplish? What space do we hope it will occupy? So it's very much from the creator standpoint or the brand standpoint. Why are we doing this? It sounds so elemental, but I think it's so fundamental to any good content strategy. Why are we doing this? What's the goal? What do we hope to do with it? And then the second one is much more audience facing. So what? Why should our audience care about it? Why does it matter to them? Why is it going to be so compelling to them? Like, okay, so we want to create this podcast around, I don't know, HVAC solutions, AI infused HVAC solutions. That's got to be a thing. Well, that's like what we want to do from the brand standpoint, because we want to share all this great wealth of knowledge and new technology. But why are your listeners going to care? Like making that leap from here's what we want to do and here's why it's going to matter to you. It's so fundamental to good content strategy. But I think especially in something where you're inviting an audience or inviting a listener to participate, to listen in week after week, you've got to offer them something that they just find irresistible in one way or another, either because it's a great story and stories will, just by their very definition, will capture our hearts and our minds, or because it's information that they want. There's a number of reasons why somebody might want to, different ways you can answer that so what question. But I think we've got to answer it.
Yep. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I really want to let you know that if you're enjoying this content, you're going to love what we have coming up very soon. Another brand podcasting event that goes even deeper into what we're discussing in this session. So for more information on that, please go to brandpodcastsummit.com. And if you're watching this session and you're finding yourself thinking, this is all great, but like, how am I going to get this started this week? I need some help with my brand's podcast. We'd love to have a chat about what you're working on. You can find all the information on how to contact us at lowerstreet.co. We also have a bunch of case studies and some examples of the things that we've been working on to give you a sense of what that looks like. So yeah, if you want help with your brand podcast, go to lowerstreet.co. And now back to what you're watching. Thanks. Awesome. One question I did want to throw in here is like, something that we say all the time is that, or the question that we always ask is like, what does success look like to you? Like why, okay, brand X, come to us, you want to start a podcast. What are your goals? And I wonder, like, I'd love to ask from your perspective, like, what is a good goal? Like what should we be thinking about in terms of we're trying to create a piece of differentiated content. We're really trying to make something that's authentic to us. But then, oftentimes we then go, well, how do we measure this? And we just look at our how many downloads is this getting? What's the reach? And like, is that really what we should be focusing on? I just wonder like what your thoughts are in terms of goal setting and what makes sense for content.
I mean, I think there's lots of reasons why we can think about how we are going to measure the success of a podcast or, again, almost any owned content asset. How are we going to measure the success of it? And there's no one right answer. It's going to be so dependent on your podcast and how you see it fitting into your overall content ecosystem. One of those might be thought leadership. We talked about that a second ago. It might be on strengthening those direct relationships with listeners or with an audience more generally. Maybe it's about showing up consistently, especially if you're a B2B brand, because you want to be in that consideration set once somebody is ready to make a purchase. So it could be part of a sales funnel, for example. It could be a creative outlet. Like you just feel like you're withering inside as a creator and you just want the opportunity to create something fun and different and you want to experiment a little bit. I think that's legitimate too. Or it could also be like some passive income or some advertising or sponsorship opportunity that you seek to tap into. It's going to really depend on, again, how it fits into your overall content program. But in terms of like how to measure that, I mean, I think there's, you know this probably better than I do, Harry, because you're so steeped in this, but there's different ways you could measure it through downloads and listens. You could measure it through listener retention or chart ratings or reviews on your podcast platform of choice. I mean, there's so many ways, I think, to measure the success of your podcast program. Mm-hmm. But here's what I look at I don't have my own podcast. MarketingProfs has a podcast, but I do not have my own podcast. But here's what I look at more generally in my own email newsletter, which is very akin in a lot of ways to podcasts because it requires a subscription. It requires somebody to opt into hearing from me week after week. And it also requires me to be very clear on who I am serving and the value that I'm bringing. All of those things, I think, translate equally well to podcasts. So when I think about my own email newsletter, I focus primarily on one specific metric, and I call it the OWBR, or I pronounce it OBER. And OBER stands for the open to write back rate. And what that means is, does somebody open my email, read it, and then are they so inspired that they write back to me? So I call it my open to write back rate. Now, in some email clients and some email platforms, you can actually measure that. You can measure the response rate. Mm-hmm. In my own, I use in the platform that I use, I don't have that opportunity to measure it through the platform. And so I do it basically just a DIY version of it. I just keep track of it. Sure. But if I get fewer than X number of responses to a specific email, I wonder why. Why did that not connect in a way that I thought it would? And so what does that mean for podcasting? I think we can take that same mindset, that same approach, and apply it to podcasts. So, for example, if you are producing a podcast, a brand podcast, are you actually inviting your listeners to offer you some kind of response, either through an audio response or through writing back to you? So I think we can take that OBER, that open to write back rate, and translate it for a podcast audience into a listener response back rate. So is your listener responding in some way or another? I don't know how to pronounce this exactly, but maybe
Lurber.
Lurber?
Lurber.
Works. I think that works.
Yeah. Very, very, it's a very comfortable word to say. I like that.
There is this mindset where we tend to think that so many of the things that we produce, and this is true for email and it's also true for podcasts, is that we think of it only as a one-way platform. Like it's something that we want to say, we want to get it out there. But I actually think the value in forming these direct relationships with an audience, to landing directly into their inbox in the case of an email, or getting directly in their ears as a podcast, is that you have that opportunity to form that direct connection. And so invite your audience, find a trigger to response, like invite your audience to write back to you, even if it's just a simple, let us know if there's another subject we can talk about that will suit your needs. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. I wouldn't ask for a big ask, but when I actually invite people to write back to me, I mean, they often do. And so I think the more triggers that we can build into our products to get our audiences to write back to us, the more engaged they will be, the more we will learn from them, we'll learn what actually does inspire them to write back to us. What is what are those topics that will actually inspire an action in one way or another? And you learn a whole lot about your audience as a result, and about yourself as a creator. So I think using that as an opportunity is just so key.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Okay, I think we'll move on to. So we've sort of talked about the tactics of how do we create something that is unique to us. We've talked about measurement and all that sort of stuff. I guess once we've launched this thing, how do you think about growing the audience of an owned media channel? Like, how do we've made something that we're really proud of. Again, this is one of the most common questions we get. We've made some amazing piece of content. How do we get that in front of the right people?
Yeah, I think there are, in terms of growing the audience, I think that there are a number of ways, but, I guess to me, it really does start with creating something that is truly special, that could only come from us. So there's almost an interim step before you think about growing your list, but like, what are the components of creating something that people will want to talk about, that people will want to share, that people will want to show up and listen to week after week? And so I think we talked about a few of these things, like for example, having a clear niche within your category. I think the more specific you can be, specific beats sweeping always. Having that clear point of view that after a while your audience will start to recognize you for. Offering just something of value, mostly insights. You can do a little bit of promotion, but I think mostly insights is key. I mean, if you need numbers, I would say like 95% insights and 5% promotion at tops. I talk a lot about this too, but I think having a non-neutral voice, and what do I mean by that? It's like, don't sound like you're reporting a 5-car pileup on a freeway. Like, you were speaking directly into the ears of one person at one time. And so, I think if you can remember that constantly, it does change the way you communicate. So
I love that so much. It's so having an opinion and a point of view.
Yeah.
There's so much, again, when we come back to the AI thing, there's just so much mediocre, middle of the road content out there. If we actually have a stance of some description, doesn't mean that we have to be radically, crazy in our points of view that we're trying to communicate, but just having an opinion and standing for something, I think is so key. That's really cool to hear you say that.
Yeah. So anyway, all that to say, I think it's important to create something really special. And again, that could only come from you, something that feels like it could only come from you. And then from there, the best way to grow always is organically, is through just inviting those in your audience to share it with somebody else. That's by far the way that I have always grown almost anything that I've created or produced. It's like, if you like this, tell other people about it, send them here, invite them to listen as well. And I love that, because it's always, it's a good indication too, just of how your audience feels about you. And so, focus on making something so great that others will talk about, number one. But then, like, more tactically, don't let your podcast exist in a kind of silo, right? It's like, don't just lock it in its native medium and let it just sit right there. I think you've got to link one asset to another. And even in very simple ways, like invite people to a landing page, say, to learn more about something that you're talking about on your podcast, for example. But even just to add a headline right there that says "Welcome podcast listeners." It's very simple, but I think it grounds your podcast into something that it feels part of an ecosystem, in other words, and just doesn't feel like it's just in its little silo. So that's the second thing. I think the third thing is, when you share it on social media, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on TikTok, wherever it is that you are engaging directly with people through social media, share the value, don't share the event. And what I mean by that is, I see this all the time on LinkedIn, where someone will say, "My new newsletter is here, like subscribe here," or "Just dropped a new podcast, listen here." Well, that's the event. Don't tell me what you did. Tell me why I should care. So what's it about? What's one tidbit that I should really know about? What's the critical thing that makes you want to, or that will make me want to listen to this podcast? So share not the event, but share the value of it.
Yeah. That's amazing. I think, I hang out in a very specific corner of Twitter and LinkedIn where there's just a lot of people with podcasts, but that is what you see overwhelmingly, is just like, here's what I did, go listen. And it's just really hard to take action on that. It's like, I'm getting like, there's just so many people doing this. Like, it's hard for me to justify 30 minutes of my life based on, check this out. It's I need more than that.
I'm just a really big fan of, especially at the beginning, of doing unscalable things. And what I mean by that is, I think there's this default in marketing that we think, we've got to get the word out as far as we can. And we've got to just, we've got to broadcast it to our whole audience and let them know what we did. But like, Harry, I've always found the most success when I want to grow a young, muling little baby of a product, like say a new podcast or a new newsletter. I found most success when I reach out individually to maybe people who I mentioned in the newsletter or the asset in one way or another. or people who I think will enjoy the issue for whatever reason, and adding just a very, simple but also personal note. I mean, I think that one-to-one outreach, it seems like, well, that's not scalable, is it? Well, I'm a really big fan of doing unscalable things, because over time, unscalable actually does scale, because you will be in the hearts and minds of the people who ultimately will recommend you to others. So look for those moments. I think it can be a game changer.
Yeah, awesome. And if I could just wave a flag for podcasting for a minute as well, I think like one of the benefits of podcasting, a lot of marketers look at podcasting and go, oh, it's so hard to measure and it's so hard to kind of grow, which it is, like, hands up, like it's not easy. We're not going to explode like TikTok overnight and kind of have millions of views all of a sudden. But the people that choose to lean in and choose to opt in, it's really, really sticky. So those things that don't scale, they're amazing, because like we might reach a handful of new people, but those new people we reach have a high likelihood of really caring and then really sticking around for the long term. And I think that's really powerful and really cool.
Absolutely true. And also, depending, most of us don't need a massive podcast, a massive listener of a massive audience for our podcast, or a massive audience for our newsletter. I think we tend to default for, to look at the size of audiences versus the quality of audiences, particularly in the brand space. I think about one of my favorite. Can I mention just a favorite brand podcast right now?
Please.
Can I do that?
Absolutely.
I have two, but one of them is a podcast that's produced by Duolingo, the language learning app. And what I love about the Duolingo podcast, and that's the name of it, by the way, it's just called the Duolingo podcast, is that you go to that landing page. If you were to Google Duolingo podcast, you go to a landing page, and it basically invites you to listen in whatever language it is that you're working on. So I had this idea that I wanted to learn Spanish last year. So I started Duolingo, and then eventually that led me to the Duolingo podcast. And what's genius about the podcast is that, one of the challenges of when you're a new language speaker is, how do I actually find opportunities to not just speak, but also to listen in a way that's not going to be completely overwhelming to me, right? Because most native Spanish speakers are going to speak very fast, and they're going to use words that maybe I don't know. But what Duolingo did is that they created a podcast that is almost like a 101 Spanish. They have a French, I think they have an Italian, and it allows you to listen to stories that are told in kind of simple terms to help you become a stronger master of Spanish or Italian or English or whatever language it is that you're learning. And so I love the way that just dovetails seamlessly with what Duolingo is all about as a business, with their mission in marketing, right? Mission of the business itself. But also it's very audience centric. They really do answer that question of what's in it for me, like the so what question. They answer it so beautifully, because it gives me the opportunity to listen to a podcast that is not super high level. I can actually understand some of the Spanish words, and I can get the gist of the story, and it's a story. So it creates momentum for me. I want to listen. So that's the kind of thing where I think a brand podcast can be such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I love that so much. And it's really interesting. What I wanted to tie a few things together is earlier you kind of hinted at this idea that like we want it to be, you want to create an amazing experience that only we can create, but like you want to focus on that experience and less on the brand and the product services, right? So we're like kind of, we're trying to make a show, I guess, that doesn't feel like it's from a brand, let's say. Interestingly, the Duolingo podcast is literally that, right? It's like, it's plastered all over it. So how do you feel about that kind of balance when we're presenting content as brands, when we're trying to create a really great experience, but then also, it's ultimately a piece of marketing. So how do you feel about that?
I mean, I think that's why I think that this formula is so important, because why you're doing it is to drive business or to serve an audience in one way or another that ultimately will drive business for you. But the so what I think is so critical to figuring out, what is it beyond the brand, like what's in it for the audience itself. And so, yeah, it doesn't bother me that the name of the podcast is the Duolingo Podcast, because it kind of makes a lot of sense. If you're gonna, from a SEO standpoint and from a search standpoint, if you are gonna look for the Duolingo Podcast, there it is.
Totally.
So it's a fantastic name. But if the content itself, if the value of the content was just about, oh, you should buy a language learning app and you should show up every single day for this, for your lessons, like they would just feel so pedantic and nobody would want that. Like that would be a ridiculous reason to create a podcast. But I love the way that they thought through it from an audience standpoint and like, what can we actually do to create that value for the people who ultimately are great buyers of Duolingo.
Yeah.
Another one of my, can I just tell you one more and then?
Yeah, I'd love that. We're getting close. I want to make sure we've got a few minutes for Q&A, but like,
okay, I'll just tell you really quickly. Another favorite podcast of mine, also a brand podcast, is called Remember Reading. And what it's about is a podcast that's created by a book publisher, and it's short seasons for this podcast. They come out like once a year, and I think there's only 4 or 5 of them in each season. But they talk about children's literature, and I'm a massive fan of children's literature and young adult literature. And I love listening to this podcast because, yes, it's from a brand, it's from a publisher, but they're talking about the backstories of some of the favorite children's books that maybe you remember from your childhood. So it's called Remember Reading because they always answer the question, remember reading Charlotte's Web, or remember reading, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, or remember reading any, classic children's book. And so it's kind of a fantastic way, I think, to tell these sort of untold stories very often using audio clips, using things from the past very often, but also making it newly relevant to an audience of parents or grandparents or people who will maybe buy those books for the kids in their lives. So that's my second one.
Amazing. I love that. So I've got one more question I want to squeeze in before we move to 5 minutes of Q&A.
Okay.
And so, by the way, warning to everyone in the chat, we might not have time to get to too many questions, but we will do our best. And then anything we can answer async, we will try to do so as well. But I want to just sort of wrap this up and kind of give our audience a clear next step maybe. So, company, listen to this. They're here, so they must be interested in podcasting. They want to start a podcast. Where should an exec begin? Like, if we're leading a marketing team, where do we start with all of this, do you think?
Well, I think the best place to start any podcast strategy is to research what kind of microphone you should use.
It's the most important thing. It's all that matters.
Totally kidding. No, totally kidding. I tried to say it with a straight face. I couldn't quite do it. So yeah, where do you start if you are a brand executive and you're thinking about doing a podcast? I think thinking through that why question, the why and the so what is so critical. Podcasting ultimately is a show me opportunity. It's an opportunity to show people really who you are. So yes, think about your why, think about your so what, and then from there go into, well, what's the format going to be, and what's the topic going to be, and what's our voice and tone and point of view going to be. And so I think always just, starting with that, why are we doing this? And then how are we going to know whether it's successful or not? And then, what are we creating? And then how are we creating it from there? So in a very short answer, I guess that's what I would say.
Amazing. And this is awesome. And I have more questions on my sheet, but I'm going to give way to questions from the audience. So we might get joined by Stephen. Here he is, the wonderful Mr. Bonnard. And Stephen, hopefully you've got a few questions for our remaining 5 minutes.
I do have a few questions. I don't think we'll be able to go through all of them, but maybe let's start with a question from Andrew, who is wondering if you've got any tips for finding or developing your brand's personality and voice.
Oh, finding your brand's personality and voice. So here's the deal. Like, I'm actually a really big fan of not worrying as much as, or I should say, this is specific to podcasts and also specific to newsletters. I think one of the mistakes that brands make with both of those things is not thinking about not thinking about the MC. In other words, not thinking about the person who is going to be the sort of host of their program or of their or of their newsletter. And I think your asset needs that. Like, it needs somebody. And so I think especially in a podcast situation, I don't worry as much about brand voice as much as I would in, some kind of text or like a blog post or an ebook or something like that. I mean, it's hugely important, but I think especially in a podcast, you have an opportunity to find the person that really does align with you and let them free, let them speak openly and honestly and authentically. I think about like what Jay Schwedelson does. He has a podcast called Do This, Not That. And it's a podcast around marketing, but specifically around email, because Jay has an event called Guru Events. Jay actually might be here. But the reason why I really like his podcast is because he does two things really well. He tells the truth. So, for example, in email right now, one of the big issues is that Yahoo and Gmail have requirements that they're going to be rolling out February 1st and a few weeks beyond that will suddenly put new requirements on to bulk emailers, right? So anybody who has a list of over, I think it's 5,000 or something like that. So when I saw this, I saw tons and tons of content out there around here's how to make sure that you are not going to get in trouble with these new requirements from Yahoo and Gmail. But do you know who I actually went to? I went to Jay and I listened to the podcast that he created on it because he tells the truth and because I trust him. And so that to me is such a great, I wouldn't say that there's something about his voice, but it's really about his personality and his point of view and the fact that I trust what he has to say.
For sure. And Robin is interested in knowing, in an extremely crowded marketplace for marketers, how do you stand out without using a gimmick, a tactical angle, or an audience angle?
Yeah. I mean, I think how to stand out is, I think we chatted about this a little bit already, but I think it's really important to think about how do you show up in a way that is going to build those direct relationships with your audience. And one of the things that I see a lot of times in marketing, and this is true of, the marketers who I work with at MarketingProfs, but it's also just true more broadly too, is that for some reason when we sit down to write an email or produce a podcast or write a newsletter, we automatically we tend to think audience, like we're talking to all of these people as if there's 100 people who are going to simultaneously open your email together in one room, or that there's 100,000 people in a stadium. Like, it's not like that, right? It's one person. And so the best way that I know to differentiate is to not worry about those tens of thousands of people, but just to think about one person and how do I communicate with them, either through writing or through speech, through just talking to them in a way that is going to, kind of further that relationship. And so I guess it's a roundabout way of saying, just think about that one person who you really want to help, or you really want to speak to, or tell a story to, and focus on that.
Going back to the one-to-one approach, definitely. I think we've got time for one last very quick question, perhaps. Elaine was wondering, in 2024, what role do you see podcasts playing within an organization's content strategy? And how may this have changed or be changing in the year to come?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak too far out, but I definitely think that this is too low right here. I think especially in a world where, as we've talked about, AI is going to help us create more and more and more, and it's going to feel very synthetic very quickly. And so the more assets that we can create, like audio, like email newsletters, the more assets that we can create that truly reflect who we are and that can form those authentic relationships with the people who matter to us, the better off we'll be. And so I don't have a crystal ball that can tell you for sure that this will rise, but I would bet, I would bet $1 on it for sure that it's going to get a lot higher, 29%. Yeah.
I may have a horse in this race, but the data doesn't lie, and listenership for podcasting is moving up a couple of percentage points each and every year.
Yeah.
So the audience is getting larger. We can measurably say that, and the content to reach them is definitely less. So that to me is a pretty encouraging signal. But Anne, this has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. for bringing your analog slides. It's exactly what the world needs today. Much more enjoyable. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much
for having me. All right. See you later.
Don't forget, if you need help with your brand's podcast, we'd love to have a chat. You can find us at lowerstreet.co. If you'd like more content like this, or to find out information on podcasting events we have coming up in the near future, head to brandpodcastsummit.com.